is a Cresco client. We're there, and we've had a lot of similar requests on what's happening to the Eskom proposed Megaflex restructuring and other engagements in that specific sector. So Shirley agreed to do this specific meeting and hopefully answer 80% of the common questions. Conscious there might be specific questions or confidential questions. So Shirley, speaking on your behalf, I assume that you would take separate questions if it's confidential, I guess via email or respectively. And then the idea was really just to touch on what's happened on the Eskom proposal for 2023, what was nurses' responses, a little bit of view of what's going into the market going forward, and then some specific questions there. And just for context purposes, I'm sure everyone is, a lot of the work obviously we're doing is looking at this NPV of savings for various renewable interventions for various clients at various stages of procurement. But the question is really, what will those savings look like based on changes to the Megaflex tariff structure? So this is a very focused discussion. It's not actually a presentation today. And to try and look at the financial impacts, so we can come up with, I guess, a house view, as well as, I guess, each client will have its own view. And these are some of the areas, and I think many of the clients have seen some of these, this slide before, or various versions of this. There is a webinar that we are hosting that's an open webinar on the 13th of July with Alan Overy and Keith Bowen from Eskom, where we're going to talk more generally on wheeling and other specifics. But today is very focused, if we can, on the Megaflex tariff structure, at least on the first part of the session, if there's other questions there. And then I've created a bit of a question and answer checklist to start with. Shirley had already sort of replied to a couple of these, and I was hoping to update this during the call itself, and then Shirley would respond at the end, and then we would circulate it as a little bit of an output. So I was hoping initially we would just work through this list, and then at the end, obviously happy to take questions and answers, and perhaps we could just do, because there are 35 of us on the call, 38 of us on the call, if we can just do hands up, and then I'll just work through, and we'll get through as many questions as we can in the time, and obviously Shirley will tell us if she can answer the question or refer to someone else, or politely take the Fifth Amendment. Is that okay as a process, Shirley?
Yes, it is. Happy to do that. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm just going to start with the questions, and maybe you could just work through them, and I will take additional notes. I won't type on the screen, but this will be used
just
as
give
the
me
agenda.
A second.
Okay.
Thanks. Sorry about that. We just also got a board presentation that we exco presentation that we on call for. So I just want to let Onika, who's on call, know that Mutenda is not going to be available. So when you get called in, if it's in this session, I won't be able to assist either. Okay, thanks.
Cool,
back to you, Robert.
Cool. So I guess can you see my my Word doc on the screen?
Yes.
Brilliant. So I mean, maybe you could just work through the questions and maybe add a bit more flavor to the quick answers you gave on the email, and just work through those as a starting point. Thank you, Shirley.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, so if we can, I'll just discuss a little bit. Our tariff plan last year, for the second time, went to the regulator and the big changes that we had proposed were firstly to the time of use changes, where we changed the ratios so that the winter prices came down a little and the summer prices went up a little. And we also changed the time of use periods, where we moved the morning 1 hour in the morning to 1 hour in the evening. Those were the big time of use changes. Then we also updated our tariffs with the cost of supply study. And in the cost of supply study, Eskom distribution purchases from transmission. In the past, we used to purchase all on an energy-only rate. And transmission has changed this to be include a generation capacity charge and an energy charge. And that effectively, even though the energy prices needed to go up because we had applied average price increases over the years, it meant that the variable energy charge actually reduced by about 20%, and we had this fixed generation capacity charge. So that was the big change, if we're looking from a time of use perspective, and the one that would have impacted wheeling customers the most. It did, where you had a high load factor, those customers actually benefited, and customers with low load factors would have paid more. So in our submission, NERSA basically did not support any of the tariff changes that Eskom had submitted, except they allowed us to introduce HomeFlex, which is a residential time of use tariff. But they did not allow us to base HomeFlex on any cost of supply study or on any of the changes that we had proposed. So the HomeFlex tariff is still based on the old time of use. It's still based on, it doesn't have a generation capacity charge. And so it was something that was just sort of aligned to the current home power, which is the other alternative tariff we would have for those customers. So they did do a reasons for decision, and those reasons for decision, if anybody wants to see them, is in the document. But basically, the objection to the generation capacity charge was really around, because of load shedding, they felt to raise a capacity charge while there's load shedding would not be prudent. And yeah, you can read the reasons for decision. Basically, they didn't support it. So I don't know, Robert, if there's questions on that.
Well, I guess they had no, they didn't really tell you why.
No.
But I understand that you are going to request a lot of this again. And if you can see my slide here, this was just our view of when you would request it again and maybe a projected date to implement. So I don't know if you could just talk through your thoughts. And I know it's just your thoughts and NERSA will decide, but maybe you could just give us a view on, are you aligned or you think we're missing it? And then if you could just touch also on, if we need to, the balancing market idea, when that might come in, which I know is outside of your current tariff application, but I know it is a question going forward.
So, as you probably aware, NERSA put out a document last year on sort of principles on how they want to change the way tariffs are done. And this document contains a lot of concepts that personally I've never seen used anywhere in the world. For example, they wanted to move away from time of use tariffs to what they're calling type of use, and basically link baseload customers to baseload generation costs. And my question always is, which baseload generator do they want? And customers, for example, that would install PV, where they would be using more peak power, would be allocated OCGT costs. And really a load factor became sort of your criteria on which tariffs were developed. As Eskom, and our response to that consultation document is also a public document, and you're welcome to ask me. We basically rejected, if I'm just talking about type of use, rejected that as a proposal because we said it's unimplementable. It's never used anywhere in the world. It would severely penalize anybody that's looking at putting own generation up, because you no longer become a baseload customer to Eskom, et cetera, et cetera. So we are sitting at a little bit of an impasse at the moment in how to actually move forward with tariffs, because there was a court case with the Nelson Mandela Business Chamber, and also against City Power and NERSA, a separate court case that dealt with that tariffs needed to be based on a cost of supply study. And both those decisions were that NERSA needs to comply with the EPP, that municipal tariffs, it was mainly around municipal tariffs, and that municipal tariffs also need to be based on a cost of supply study and not benchmarks. Now, Eskom doesn't have tariffs now that are based on a cost of supply study. Our tariffs do recover Eskom's overall costs, but the tariffs themselves don't. So we are sitting a little bit with an impasse on how to actually proceed, because of the court decisions, and because Eskom unbundling, our tariffs need to properly reflect generation, transmission, and distribution costs in their respective bundles, if I can call it that. We are hoping to engage with the regulator through our acting group chief executive to discuss the way forward. So at this stage, we don't actually know what we are going to do for next year. But the big thing we would want to do is firstly base our tariffs on the updated cost of supply study, and secondly, at least do the time of use changes. We probably are still going to see resistance on the generation capacity charge. So even though we believe that is an exceptionally important change that is needed to be made to the tariffs, because the related to the fixed costs of its Eskom generation and the procurement from RPPs, which even though we buy at a kilowatt hour basis, those costs are fixed to us. So yeah, to answer the question, sorry, I've gone a real long way around this, is we are at an impasse on what is actually going to happen next year. So we're already sitting now in July, and we were hoping we would have had some direction at this stage. So we're going to be pushing for those meetings with the regulator. But our impression is that this methodology is one of the reasons why this NERSA methodology, which is still not, we still don't have a view of what the next steps are, even on that methodology, is probably the reason why we are getting resistance from NERSA to make these tariff changes. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you, Shirley.
Back to you.
Yeah, so maybe I can just recap what you're saying a little bit. Is subject to maybe a way forward, you'll be resubmitting number 1 in my little PowerPoint, number 3 in 2024, waiting for NERSA response. The generating capacity charge will probably be delayed, but is still an important part of your Megaflex planning restructuring. Point number 5, where we're looking at different escalations, is that still thinking there?
Yes. So what would happen with a tariff restructuring? Firstly, we, even if we made no changes to any of the weightings, would mean that energy charges would go up and network charges would come down, because we've applied average increases to all the rates since 2012. And as we know, that the biggest increases are sitting in the generation space. So, for example, just a simple example is the electrification and rural subsidy. if you look at it, it looks like there's this massive contribution to subsidies sitting in the in that. But when we updated it with the cost of supply study, the energy charges went up and the electrification rural subsidy went down, because now we have better ideas of what the costs were versus what the tariffs should be recovering. So you're getting a rebalancing sort of the charges, you know, when you update with the cost of supply study. We also looked at the weightings of the fixed and variable network charges. And even so, if you look at Eskom at the moment, 10% of Eskom's tariff revenue is fixed and 90% is variable. If we updated and even increased the weighting of the fixed charges, network charges, without the generation capacity charge, our fixed charges would go to 9%. It would actually reduce if you based it on exactly what we had submitted. So we took the generation capacity charge and converted it back to an all energy charge, all energy time of use charge, we would actually sit with less fixed charge revenue. So yes, we would still want to increase the fixed charge components and reduce the variable charge, but this is really a weighting. We do it as a weighting. So
okay, so
yeah.
So there won't be actual, in the short term, it'll be a reweighting, but over time,
Yeah.
do we see it? Because I mean, we're modeling 20-year PPAs. Do we see energy and network charges escalating at different rates after you've done the reweighting? Is that still part of your thinking?
Yes, it will have to happen because of the unbundling of Eskom. So into the future, transmission, for example, will go on their own and apply for tariffs that they would need. And I'm assuming generation and the same with distribution. But the generation costs are a pass through for us. Transmission is a pass through for us, and we would need to then restructure our tariffs based on that. So let's say transmission's tariffs would go up by 10% and generations by 20% and distributions by 9%, for example. You would actually start to see in the tariffs themselves, we will probably stop applying an average increase to all the rates going forward. Well, that's one assumption. The other is, as distribution, we would, similar to what the municipalities do, just apply an average increase until you do a cost of supply study, and then you fix the weightings when you do that. So going into the future, there are probably going to be different increases, potentially depending on what the regulator, and I mean, when Eskom does applications to the regulator, we actually do them as generation, transmission, and distribution as 3 separate licensees. But NERSA has only once ever made decisions for the 3 separate licensees. They did that in MYPD 1. Since then, they've just made decisions on an average price increase basis. We are hoping for MYPD 6 that they're going to be doing that as separate licensees. And then we would need to build that process into our tariffs in the way that it gets applied into the future.
Thank you. Can I touch on point 6 and 7 quickly?
Sure.
So environmental levy, any more thoughts on that, please?
So, yeah, that's, I don't know much about. Obviously, when the carbon tax comes in, that becomes a cost item for Eskom, and we would have to recover that, just like the environmental levy is a cost item for us. So that is built into the generation costs, and it becomes hidden, if you want to call it that, just like any, well, when I say hidden, it is a line item in our cost application. And the carbon tax then would be, if it gets replaced by the carbon tax or if it gets added on top of the carbon tax, I'm not sure.
Okay. So we're not sure if it, because our view was it would be replaced by the carbon tax equivalent, but at the moment it might be a double up. We're not sure.
Yeah. Look, if you want a discussion on that, I could always involve Gina Downs, who's the expert on that subject. I'm not.
Okay, cool. No, thank you. I think that would be helpful. So we'll definitely appreciate a follow up on that.
Mm.
And then the last one, the generator use of systems charge. So what we've seen in many of our wheeling applications is that the IPP is either silent on that during bidding and then arrives to say, oh, this is the tariff, or they give us a number based on your current Eskom spreadsheet, Shirley, that you provide. And then they say if it changes, it'll be a pass-through in the tariff. And we're obviously trying to make our view as Cresco, at least, is what sits on the generator side is their issue, and what sits on the load side, all the things you've mentioned in the slide on the load side, but that's not always possible. But I mean, at the moment, it ranges between, I think we've seen 1.5 cents to 5 cents, depending really where it sits in the network, because it is voltage and location specific. But do you have a view on where this might go?
Yeah,
please?
So we are busy with quite a detailed study. There's work being done on the transmission side, and as you're aware, the transmission zones were designed in such a way that we wanted to encourage generation in specific areas, and those areas are now constrained areas. So, for example, in some zones, the losses charge is negative, but we are finding now that those zones, the losses charges are actually positive, where in other transmission zones, generation, should now be encouraged. So we definitely know that on the transmission side, there is work being done on relooking at how those charges are raised. And then on the distribution side, there's detailed studies being done to develop a cost of supply methodology for generators. So transmission already has a cost of supply methodology. They and just the work needs to be done on that side. And in distribution, as I said, the work's been done to develop such a methodology, because the methodology we used, transmission was a lot more sophisticated. On distribution, we used a very simplified approach where we said generators reduce distribution losses because we don't have to buy from transmission. That premise is no longer applicable either, because also in certain zones we are seeing losses increasing significantly, where these customers, where the generators now receive a rebate based on reduction of losses. So what I can tell you is it is going to change. I can't tell you how it's going to change. So I know that this is a risk for people that are entering into these long-term PPAs. And really, because the world has changed from when the 2011, when we first introduced these generator use of system charges. So yeah, it is going to change. I can't tell you what it's going to change to, but as soon as we start to get numbers and things like that, then we will go out, obviously, on consultation. There is also a little bit of confusion. There was a generator that is connected to a municipal network, and this municipality did not know how to calculate generator use of system charges. So they went to NERSA and they said, can they just use Eskom's as a proxy in the interim? And NERSA responded that there is no framework for use of system charges, therefore they can't approve them. So again, there's that level of confusion that is sitting in the industry on this particular one, even though Eskom has got generator use of system charges. So okay. I don't have an answer for you on that one, or other than to say it will change.
Okay. So, and then you touched on transmission losses. So we recently used a cogeneration facility as a work example for a client, because obviously they're the ones who've really been wheeling since 2004. And I was quite surprised when we actually ran through the bill that the transmission losses as a percentage of peak, standard, and off-peak were the same as a percentage. So obviously they were different in quantum, but as a the losses as a percentage of the bill of the peak time was, I think, about 9.6% on average. Is that actually how we would normally look at it? Because I always thought that the transmission losses per time of use period were actually slightly different, and I'm conscious that they are different per zone. I don't know if that question makes sense, Shirley.
Yeah, it does. They should be different. So please share that example with me. We need to check why.
Okay. So my premise that they would be different should be right, because that obviously does then influence the type of generation and the overall cost of wheeling or the lower savings. Yeah.
As a percentage, they should be the same because it's the same percentage that is applied. But as a quantum, it will be different.
So as a quantum, they were different.
Yes.
As a percentage of the peak tariff, they were the same. So is
yes. Yes.
Okay, so that's correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought that they would be slightly different there. And then I guess I think you've touched on a lot of these. Two more questions I can, and I don't know if the balancing market, you're the right person. I guess that's more Keith, but I don't know if you can touch on that. And then I have two more questions, and then I'll open it to the floor.
Yeah. So the balancing market, ideally, Keith needs to talk to that. And his ideas around how this will work with wheeling. I would prefer you pull Keith in to talk about it, but there is work being done, and really what it means is generators, and I suppose they're going to decide on size, will become balance responsible parties. They can either be balance responsible directly to the system operator, or become balance responsible to a distributor, and which would mean that they would have to give hour-ahead forecasts for the next day, and if there's a deviation from that, they could either be penalized in terms of the system operator having to go and procure that shortfall, and the cost of that will go to the generator, or the other way around, they could even be paid for additional power that they could provide to balance the system. So yeah, and that's basically how it'll work, and then this will work together with how we do wheeling. Yeah.
Agreed. I mean, and that's the premise we've been saying to a lot of clients is, you need accuracy of forecasting based on the load and the generator. And obviously, if you underperform generation at 12 o'clock in the day, it might actually save you money. But if it's at 6 o'clock in the evening and you're buying at an OCGT equivalent or peak times, you could lose all your savings in one day because of a couple of hours lost. Is an extreme example, but I think that's the premise we've been considering.
And also, in the future, loads could also become balance responsible, because it's not just generation, it's on the load side too.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay. So just to understand on the forecasting, if I can, so obviously loads provide an annual forecast, and then a 48-hour and a 24-hour, and then the generator does that too. Under REAP, they obviously have tried to put in a penalty for inaccuracy of forecasting in the last round. I'm not sure if it actually got implemented in the final PPA or not there. But do you see a situation in which obviously large loads, based on them maybe achieving 50% renewable penetration, obviously having to also forecast the generation and being responsible for that? So then I guess theoretically the generators will submit the documents directly to Eskom as a generator, but then also through the load, and then the load will have to consolidate and look at its net position. Obviously, it has to do that anyway, but for reporting purposes to Eskom.
Yeah, it's going to both loads and generators in future. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess that then in theory is, if you cascade all the loads and all the generators of scale, that'll allow the ISMO to understand potential risks in the grid dispatch over time.
Yeah, because I mean, basically, dispatchable and non-dispatchable plant will all have to be, this includes Eskom generation, would all have to be part of this balancing market. Yeah.
Correct. Correct.
So
Okay.
work is starting on there, but I mean, Keith is really the guy to answer all the difficult questions around balancing. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, cool. So 2 more questions. One is, and maybe the first one is a bit easier, is the number 6. Is there a view that maybe over time we might see another change in time of use being off-peak being put into the middle of the day? Obviously, we've seen that already happen in Europe. Do you have a view on that?
Yes. The whole premise around time of use tariffs is it needs to mimic sort of a system. System prices, it doesn't do it perfectly. So if you're looking at time of use, as the system changes, and we've already seen how the system has changed, we would then want to put signals in place that would incentivize consumption and generation in different time periods. So yes, the time of use changes will happen, but if I look at just the resistance we're getting to make this small change, it's always going to be dependent on what the regulator can do. But also going into the future, the idea is really to have a market and to have a market operator. So, and if there is participation in that, then the prices could change hourly. So customers would have a choice of either going into the market or being fixed into a time of use regime, which tries to mimic what a market would do on a very what's the right word? Sort of on a very average basis. Yeah. It also is I just want to mention on time of use. Time of use is not necessarily cost reflective in, it is more about signals to assist the system operator to manage the system. So when does the system operator have the biggest problem? In peak times, and therefore you want to create signals that reduce peak consumption. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I guess the conundrum we have is that in many of the PPAs, we're referencing time of use as it is today. But over 20 years, time of use today is definitely going to be different. And if you have a non-dispatchable technology, you can't load follow. And if you PV and you're offsetting standard hours today, which look reasonable, but in the future it could be offsetting off-peak hours, that severely impacts the potential savings. Cool. My last question is, so there's been this, we were quite excited to hear, and you don't believe anything you read in the press, but let's go with it, that Eskom had facilitated, I guess, theoretically, a cross-border wheeling deal between a dispatchable generator in Mozambique and a mine in South Africa. We're not close to the detail. And in return for that, the mine was given some element of load shedding prioritization or deprioritization, should I say, because the technology was dispatchable. Speaking to Valley at the NRS, that concept has also come up, although not validated to the same level. So I don't know if you could talk to point number 5, if you have any views, please.
I don't know about this, and I don't have any views, but I know the whole thing around curtailment, it's not an exemption from load shedding, it would be an exemption from curtailment if it's a large customer.
Yes,
but basically what the principle around curtailment is, you need to prove that you can reduce your consumption in a particular hour. And if you have got a generation plant, it would specifically battery storage, or in this case dispatchable generation, then they would look at it. You guys are aware of the Frankfurt case, where they were arguing because of PV they can be exempt from load shedding, but it was a PV without any storage, and Eskom said you can't be exempt. So the fact that you have non-dispatchable renewable plant doesn't exempt you from load shedding. But the right person to speak to there would be somebody like Jose Carrera in Eskom.
Cool.
But I know nothing. I don't know anything about this particular plant. So you would have to prove with curtailment that you are contributing to your particular reduction.
Thank you. No, thank you. Perfect, Shirley. Thank you. So, I mean, that's all my questions. So I don't know if the members would like to just put their hand up or could put a quick question in the chat there from anyone on the team. You did such a good job, Shirley. It's easy to, that's 35 minutes.
Either that or I frightened everybody. You know, yeah. But I mean, I do want to just mention that as we start to develop, you know, as soon as if we know what we're going to do on the tariff plan, we will communicate, you know, and we always try the EIUG, you know, that they're the guys that will get this information sort of hot off the press. And same on the generators. Whatever we're going to be do on the generator charges, we will definitely consult even before we sort of have a formal approval in Eskom, just to make sure that we've consulted beforehand. Yeah.
You mean even quicker than the Chris Yelland WhatsApp group, Shirley?
Oh yeah,
cool.
maybe we should join that WhatsApp group.
It's not worth it, I promise.
Okay.
Precious has a question. Thanks, Precious. Is there an update on the cost of supply study finished? I think there were lots of cost of supply studies that you mentioned. Precious, do you want to just be specific on which one, please? Precious, are you there?
Yes,
Shirley,
yes. Just the latest. I'm not even sure what versions and variations of that study are.
So, I mean, I think there was the Eskom cost of supply study, the generator use of systems, and a few. Maybe you could just recap on all of them, Shirley, if you can.
Okay, so we did do a cost of supply study for our 2020 tariff plan. And then we updated it for the tariff plan that we submitted last year. And we have done an updated version of that, which would be used if there are any tariff changes for next year. But that cost of supply study is based on loads. And so we are busy trying to develop a cost allocate. It's really a cost allocation methodology for generators, which will then form part of our cost of supply study for loads. So how it works currently, we work out what the loads costs are, and then we use actually the loads, because on distribution we only have network charges for the 66 kV, the high voltage category. We use the loads cost reflective value, and then we rebate it by the negative loss factors. We want to now make sure that we cost generators properly. So it's the cost of supply is a cost allocation methodology that assumes the costs as in total have been approved by the regulator for generation, transmission, and distribution. Generation's costs are purchased by transmission. Transmission sets up a tariff. We buy from transmission use of system charges, ancillary service charges, and network charges, and that's a pass-through. And then the distribution side of it is where it gets a little bit more detailed, where we allocate based using statistical methods and so on. Thanks.
Thank you. Precious, I hope that answers the question. Andre, do you want to jump in?
Thanks, Rob. Shirley, my question is around the carbon tax portion, and I believe you mentioned that it would be probably a cost factored into the current active energy charges. Any views of having that as a standalone as well, similar to what the environmental levy is, even if it won't replace the environmental levy? But and the reason for the question basically is that one would assume that that carbon tax portion that Eskom would be subject to would be a function of the emissions factor, so it will be changing depending on what your emissions was per annum, and hopefully that will go down as more renewables are coming online. And I'm just from a transparency perspective, would be good to have that as a separate charge with a emission factor applied, or view of what that would look like. And I know we've been trying to get a forward-looking view of what Eskom's grid emission factor would look like from now to 2040, 2050, because I know Eskom is also trying to decarbonize the generation system or the grid to an extent. So just any view on how that would work? And I know you said that there's a different person that could probably give more insight to that, but if you have got a view, it'll be appreciated.
So the environmental levy, by the way, is not shown as a separate charge. It's included as a cost to so it's not separated, it's actually included in the energy charges.
I believe it was, sorry, I believe it was before 2012. I think they might have changed it 2012, 2013. It got blended into the...
Yes. The reason, we did show it as a separate charge, and then we blended it, as you correctly said. And the reason why we did that is because the environmental levy didn't increase, but everything else increased. So what happens is, let's say NERSA gave us a 10% tariff increase. It actually meant that the increase to the energy charges was not 10%, because included was the environmental levy. And we had to do this really complicated exercise to pull the environmental levy out and then work out what the increase on the energy charges were. So you saw this like different increase, which really confused people. And then we said it's a tax, and taxes are a cost, like rates taxes to Eskom, to generation, and VAT, so well, not VAT, that's a bad idea, a bad example. So it just becomes a pass-through cost for us, and therefore we put it back in. And I know people want to know exactly what this is. Maybe, Robert, what we can do is we can try and get Gina to talk a little bit about the tax and the forward-looking emission factors and what Eskom is doing on that side.
I think I'm just saying a session like this would be helpful. I would agree. I think it would help. Agree.
It does just complicate things when you show the carbon tax as a standalone. I suppose what we could always do for information is state that 2 cents a kilowatt hour or whatever included in your energy charges is actually Eskom's carbon tax contribution. Yeah, I mean, it is something we could look at going into the future, though. And I do understand why customers want to see that.
Thanks, Shirley.
So I've made a note of it.
Well, thanks. We'll follow up with you, Shirley, too. Thank you. Henny, question, please.
Thank you very much. And Shirley, thank you for the information. I think we can all appreciate that this is a very complex and dynamic environment at the moment. My question is just around the impasse that you mentioned, and some of the tariff applications that have now been rejected by NASDA, and you're going to reapply. I just want to understand, is that for FY26? Because the average tariff increase has already been announced by NASA for next year? Are you going to work within that frame, or would you like to reopen that application? And then also, what does that mean for specific RCAs? Are you also in an impasse with calculating RCAs, or is that going on as per normal? Thank you.
It's a good question. Basically, there's two processes that deal with tariffs. One is the MYPD process, and as you correctly said, there's already been a decision on Eskom's cost recovery for this year and for next year. So we're busy working now on what we're calling MYPD 6, which is going to be for not next year, the year thereafter. And the RCAs and whatever sits in that process. The process on the tariff side of it is where we now try and update the tariffs based on those decisions for generation, transmission, and distribution using a cost of supply study. So even though NERSA has made a decision on the revenue for next year, we would still like to be able to restructure our tariffs within that approved revenue. So whatever the decision is, let's say NERSA says we can restructure our tariffs, then we would give NERSA rates based on, let's say, this year's tariffs. And then whatever decision they make will then, let's say they approve what we've changed, we then just apply the increase that NERSA approves to those rates for next year, so that we get the same revenue that NERSA has decided on for next year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. Maybe then just a small follow-up question on that. So I understand that Eskom based its previous increases on getting to cost reflectivity, but now if the tariff structure changes and new cost of supply studies, I assume you don't really have a view of what the cost reflectivity would be for the different licensees. So we might see a different tariff increase application path based on the work that's now being undertaken.
No, that won't change the overall revenue decision at all. So the revenue decision is the revenue decision. If NERSA says Eskom can make 300 billion rand next year, 250 is generation and 25 is transmission and 25, I'm just giving rough numbers, is distribution. We would take the 25 for distribution and calculate our network charges based on that. Same for transmission and same for the energy. But restructured in terms of like the time of use and whatever. So everything we do, all the work we do has in the tariff design process has to come back to the money that NERSA has approved. So they're separate processes. But we have to, if NERSA has approved 300 billion, that's exactly what we have to recover when we do a tariff restructure.
Okay, no, thank you. I was actually talking about the years after that, but I don't want to take
the years after that.
All the time now, yeah.
Yeah, so the years after that, yes. Because of also, transmission going outside of Eskom, even our MYPD process is going to have to change. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Okay. I do have one last question, Shirley. I don't know if you'll kick this to someone else. I mentioned the cross-border deal with Mozambique, and obviously touched on the dispatchable generation there. Do you have a view on wheeling cross-border, irrespective of the technology and perhaps the timing of that? I know Eskom has noted that they are aggressively trying to buy any excess energy in SAP, not much around outside of hydro season, but do you have any thoughts on allowing particularly loads in South Africa access to generation north of the border, primarily hydro, obviously because of renewable requirements?
My understanding is that is allowed. There's obviously from a balancing perspective, because remember the way it works is because you settle on the day ahead values. I know Keith is actually working on something on a balancing agreement. So I think for all of those, or if there are any, they would, number one, need an import license to do that. And number two, we would, even before there's a balancing mechanism, we would require balancing to be part of that contract. But Keith can also talk to that one as well. Yeah.
I mean, generally, our understanding is that previously you needed your host utility to sponsor you, but now with the Africa Green Co, that's no longer quite there. But the host utility does need to offer a balancing,
yes,
if required, and I guess that talks to exactly what you said. No,
yeah.
cool. Okay, but we think it's moving quicker than it did when we had this chat a year ago. So that's great to hear. Okay.
Yeah, I think the the challenge is going to be in the licensing process, but yeah.
Yes. Okay. Cool. I don't know if there are any last questions. I'm happy to quickly take them from anyone on the team. I think that's a no. So just in terms of process, we have taken some notes. We will update the Word document, Shirley, that I sent to you previously and I showed on the screen. I'd appreciate if you can just correct some of our views if they are materially different and we've understood. And then if you're happy, we were going to circulate them to this team. Presented as Cresco's views, but if you're happy to obviously say some of them are your views, also the same. And we have recorded this. I think there are a few people on this from the buyer side who couldn't make this call, and we will share that correspondingly. But thank you very much, as always, for your time. Really appreciate it. Yeah. And that.
And if any, yeah, I'm just so sorry we can't give like more definitive answers on some of the things. Yeah.
It's better than nothing, to be honest. And I'm conscious that 90% of the view is sitting with some people in Pretoria.
Yeah. It's outside of our control to a very large extent.
Yeah. I mean, we're just on as an aside, we do a lot of tariff applications for the storage industry, and their NERSA regulatory approach is just completely non-aligned with commercial reality, and it is very difficult to reconcile between a return on asset base plus expenses versus competitive tariffs. Yeah, but we feel your pain.
Yeah,
all good. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us on Wednesday morning. Hope you have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you,
very much.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.